there was a tremendous explosion, and it wasn't very far from us. We got up, we dusted our clothes off, and looked around, and then there was some kind of language that you wouldn't want to hear around this table, in anger, because the fellows thought, it's those poor girls who that rocket had landed amongst, had given their life right through to the bitter end, manning the guns, trying to get that rocket down. And so now we felt bad enough for that. But by that time, I had lost my hearing with the blast, not all of it. And then I also, when I jumped out of that truck, the blood was running off the end of my fingers from where I had cut my hand and so on. But 35 years later, the gravel started coming out of the palm of my hand when Dorothy and I were on a holiday down south one time. Can you imagine that? All that time. So anyway, we got in their trucks and we went on further and proceeded down the estuary beside there. And as we went down there, we knew that there was going to be a landing barge for us, an invasion craft, to go up to the over the beach. And so we had our eyes open for this thing all the time. We never saw it, and finally one day we came up the dawn came, and then before we knew it, there in front of us was a big ship. It's called a Liberty ship, which is made just for wartime purposes. Well, they came along close enough to us that our trucks and our water tanks and our equipment could be all loaded onto that. And then we went on to that also. And at the time that we went on to that, we had an issue to us of life jackets, and an issue that came with instructions on how to put it on and take it off. And we went through that maybe 2.5 times, when all of a sudden there was a terrific explosion on that ship. And it was right above our heads where this had happened. You know, we were all pretty shaken with that. And again, it was so much, that blast of that was so much that I lost my hearing, that I could scarcely hear anything. And the big gun that had gone off was one of the biggest on the ship, and it was damaged because this happened when it was in the breach with the end of the barrel block still on. Oh, no. So the gun would be shattered. Eh? Yeah. And I guess it upset a lot of our fellows, there's no doubt about it, because I wasn't the only one that had bad hearing after that. And that evening, we were about 4 of us standing by the rail of that Liberty ship, just relaxing on it, when
in the darkness, because all the lights were turned off.
it was darkness. You couldn't see anything, and so the fellows started talking excitedly amongst themselves in that, and they weren't. I wasn't participating in what they, because I couldn't hear them, and then one of them pointed out that out in the water, and then mouthed what it was, German U-boat, German torpedo boat. And then I could just faintly begin to hear this thing coming towards us and getting closer and closer. And then the guns on our ship that shoot a pellet about that long, the whole thing, the cartridge and the shell itself is about that long, and they're about that round. Now, every 7th one of those will glow in the dark. And so they can trace that when that's going out, and you see it going out in the water, and it's heading right to that torpedo boat. And a few minutes later, we seen and heard that torpedo boat taking off from our ship. The firepower on our ship was too much for that boat. And it was really something just to stand there and watch these shells still going out, trying to catch up with that boat. Well, yeah, we weren't very far from being sunk. That torpedo boat must have been extremely close before it turned around and went away, but not close enough, you know, without them getting hit. Yeah. So that's two instances where I've had that sharpness in my ears. I'm not going to tell any more about that because that's all there is to it.
But you know the interesting part. Are you finished? Did you want to say something else?
Well, yeah, I would say something else because we then came to our landing craft, and we got over the side of this big ship, and again our things were taken off it onto another one, which went to the land. And at this time, we had come to the shores of France, and there must have been 100 like us in front of us, between that shore and us, that were all going to go up on that beach. And in that time, we had all been gone down this great ladder. Now the ladder was on the side of the ship. Now the side of that ship, I don't know how high it was from the water, but it must have been 40 feet. And what they had was a great rope ladder about 15 feet wide, and it had strips of rope down that a fellow would have about that much space to put his feet in if he was going down. And as you went down this thing, you would hear somebody's steel cleats on their boots hit the helmet of a ship below, and the voices would be raised. and so our whole group went down that way and quite safely got into the landing craft. And then the part I was in was up by the front of it, would be one of the first going off. And I left that, and I went back around to see who was going to be our skipper, who was going to be the captain. And when I saw the captain, met him, told him who I was, and so on. And we've talked for, I guess, maybe pretty near an hour about, goodness, I don't remember what. But
He was Scottish.
Pardon?
He was Scottish, eh?
I don't know what he was. But when I turned to leave, he said, "Oh, hold on a minute there, laddie, hold on." I guess he was.
Yeah. I remember when I typed it up.
Yeah. And so I paused, and he indicated I'd be back in a minute, but he was gone about 20 minutes before he came back. And then he came up and he took my arm and he said, "Here, laddie, I want you to have this." He said, "You're going to use it more than I will ever need to use it." And it turned out to be his American Army blanket. Now, the American Army blanket was superior to what blankets we had. Do you remember that brown blanket?
I remember it very well, because we had it years and years and years until there was almost nothing left of it. Yeah.
So I left then and took my place in the boat. And then I looked out. I said there was hundreds in front of us. Now, that was early in the morning, and now it's getting on for evening when it's getting dusk, and that's when our craft went up to the shores. And we got up to the shore, and actually, in that landing craft, we had everything was all set to go down onto the beach. And eventually when that went down, and we all started down that, we went over through the water, over some rocks, up some sand, and then started up a slope. And we turned around and looked, and there along the shoreline, we could see where there was tanks that had been battered, and ships, boats that had been shattered, absolutely shattered, and half sunk landing craft. Wow. Now this was in the fights that had gone on before. Right? So we were free then to go on up that beach. So what we did, we must have walked about another 600 yards, and there was a road there. And on that road was our trucks with food for us. So that was our landing on the beaches of France. No, everything had been loaded into our trucks from that ship. So the minute we had finished eating, those trucks started up, and we went up the coast of France further, and further back in, not far from where we came to an old winery, and it was that winery that we were going to set up all our equipment, and have that as a base until such time as we could move out of this area that was being held for more supplies to come in. So one day, though, I came back into that building from doing something, forget what it was, but it was just evening and getting dark. And I noticed the fellows had blankets strung up, and I could see the slit of light coming out from between them. And I moved them outside, and here was 6 fellows sitting down, and they all had something in their hand that they were carving. And it turned out that these were pieces of wood that were carving the names of 3 fellows who had died that morning, who had been sent out to get information and never came back. And one was Lieutenant Clemmer. He was a fine man. And Sergeant Bill Toast, he again was an excellent sergeant. And a fine man, sapper, George Bell. George Bell would be the driver for the Jeep that they had, and those 2 probably sat in the back until they got to where they were going to do whatever to get the information they needed to get and come back. Well, it was found out what happened to them. A French woman had been very friendly with the Germans when they were occupying. Now, they had occupied France for quite some time. And whether they had encouraged her to or not, we never knew. But she had taken the signs down of landmines, and that's what their Jeep hit. It hit a landmine, and they were killed almost instantly, except the sapper who had been driving, and he lasted another day and a half, and he died. And eventually, they found out where that French woman was, and she was made to justify what she had done. Yeah. And then I go on to finish the talk and tell them that we've been, from here on in, we had been many places, seen many things, and done many things. We've been through France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. And we've been making maps, battle maps, all the way. And I said, the first Canadian Corps Field Survey is a company that deserves a great deal of credit. They made 428 battle maps in the course of those months that we're going through those countries.
What were the maps for? Tell them.
The battle maps?
Why did you make maps of the area?
Every officer, every commanding officer wants to know what he's going to go into. And he wants to have all of his officers know and have one of those maps. And very likely, the sergeants who are going to lead are going to have one of those maps. So the maps were printed from the work that we did. We would make the map, draw it, and then we'd have all the negatives, and they would be put together, and then it was my job, when those sheets are put together and a copy made from it, by section, we're given the copies of each of the maps that were done, and we would inspect them using all the materials they'd been made with, and pick out the things that needed to be corrected on them. Now, that's a big job too.
So they needed to know, this was before the front lines came in, right? So they needed to know what kind of terrain that they were going to come up against.
Yeah, that's right. These were battle maps that were made. Maybe when the battles even started, the map would be finished, and they would get the map and work from there on. Yeah, it's quite something.
Yeah.
You've used the term sapper.
Well, Sapler is a private,
Okay,
but he's in the engineers,
okay.
yeah. And those,
There were demolitions and stuff too, were they not?
pardon?
Demolitions and stuff like that as well?
Well, no, that would be a different section of the engineers.
Oh, okay.
Ours was strictly mapping. And really, you never hear anything about our company, ever. And so that's why I wanted to say something about it.
Absolutely.
So-
These things.
To make the maps, what would they do? Like, how would you do that?
Well, let me tell you something else. I got an invitation on Friday from Sheila, Bill's a daughter,
Yeah,
and asking me if I would like to go over and have dinner with them, lunch on Saturday. That she was going to have somebody, some others come in, which was all their family. All their boys have been married, the girls are married,
yeah.
and so they were all there when I went. And did I tell you I had this thing with me and somebody read it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's when I said, well, I think what I should do is read that when we can all listen to it. And that's what I did.
Yeah.
And now, what was your question again?
How about you made the maps?
Yeah. Well, I gave a talk on that and 2 years ago. And when I was asked, I was in the house and the phone went and this voice came on and asked who it was, and I said, yes, that's me. And he said, well, he had a foreign voice. And he said, we'd like to know, have you come and tell us how you made your maps? And I said, well, I think you have the wrong person. I was just going to hang up, and he said, no, I'm with the geomatics. Now, geomatics is the mapping. It used to be the Canadian Institute of Surveying, but now it's got another name because it got into more electronics, and so it became geomatics. And so then he explained what they wanted to do. They were having the annual dinner, which I always attended, and they wanted me to be the speaker to tell them how we made the maps during the war, because they don't make them that way anymore. You know, they've got modern equipment. But Bill Clark, he was in that British outfit while I was in the Canadian one. And his concept when they went, it must have been the same when they went over those beaches, was that they made the maps with plane tables and all sorts of gadgets that you have to walk around with and set them up, and you've got to have definite ground control and so on. And eventually, I know somewhere around 1940, they started to use aerial photographs. Well, we had been using aerial photographs for some time mapping in Canada. Our Army, end of the mapping, had gone overseas in 1940, but they had none of the equipment to use to make maps. And what they had offered to them were such things as things this wide and this deep and 6 feet high, as an instrument to get information off to be able to look at the photographs, which was out of the question. You could never do that in going through the battlefields. So what they did, they devised ways of mapping the maps. Once they had the control positions and could have airplanes that could give them decent photography at different elevations depending on the scale of the map that was required. And the maps, those photographs, we would have to identify that position of that control on the photograph. Those photographs would then be reduced on a glass slide, and they would be projected down onto a steel tabletop, which would have some kind of copy paper on it, and with the control points. And so what you had to do was have people who could look into an instrument and adjust it so that they had the points on the photo and the points on the ground the same. And that was a simple thing that had been invented in our unit before I got there. I didn't know that. And I took it that this was the standard way of doing the maps. Because Bill's section, Clark, that when he got wounded and was out of the war for the rest of the game, was 6 days after they went in 6 days after D-Day, and it was shortly after that when he was wounded, and that's why I wanted to take this to him to show him what what our end of it had been like, and I lost the track. Anyway, what was evolved was a thing that would have 2 legs and 1 leg up there. So it was a triangle setting on points on the whatever the base is. And you could turn a screw and you could cause that to tilt, to raise, or to lower. So you could bring the photograph to the exact scale of these, whatever the ground was whatever the control was. And then it had a mirror in the top part of that would reflect down onto the paper. And that's why you move these screws until you get that level part reflected from the part like this until those points. Then you could draw whatever it is that your map requires, and accurately.
Including the changing terrain as well, because
Oh, absolutely.
change on a daily basis.
Absolutely, and make a big difference.
Was that what they called a stereoscope?
Yeah.
Like
No,
3D.
that was the bopper.
Oh, the bottom?
Yeah, that was the bopper. The stereoscope was what you look through to bring the pictures together.
Right.
Yeah, the 2 pictures. So, using those, you could take a flight, and you could just set that whole flight all the way along. Now, you would just have 2 of these projectors, so you'd have to keep photographs and moving this along. Yeah, you'd have the 2 projectors, but you'd be able to move the paper and that to put it in position. So what we would do a room as big as this. If this was squared off, and on the floor, we would have this grid, which would have the control points on it. And that's where we would get our basis for our maps. So there was a lot to moving from one place and setting up again somewhere else. And it was to our advantage if in the future, where we were going to go the next place, was, let's say, a school.
Less of a target.
That we could have a big space in which to work, and not only just in that one section, but then you got your drafting section and everything else. And we only had once when we had a school.
How many maps would you be able to make in what time period?
Well, this was interesting. We got along quite a way when we were getting all the heads of any army that was in the Second World War, I'm sure of it, relating to Europe, come and visit and see how the maps were made, including the British to come and see how the maps were made. So the whole thing was invention that has allowed us to make as many maps in the hours that we did. So one time, our commanding officer made an agreement with Montgomery that we'd make a map in one day, 24 hours. And so the fellows went out, left the building, and just photographs that will be supplied when we get to the building, and start to map. this area that we were going to do in 24 hours. And so that was done section by section by section.
That's amazing, 24 hours to do that.
Yeah, 24 hours.
Yeah.
So it turned out we did it in 29 hours, which again is remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When Dad and I were in Holland in 2005, one of the gatherings we were at, we talked to a pilot from the Air Force who was also over there. And I think it turned out that he was one of the pilots who would take photographs and bring the photographs back from his fighter plane and deliver them to somewhere. He didn't know where he was delivering to. All he knew he was bringing back photographic plates to somewhere. And he was in the same area that Dad was at. And so the pictures this guy was taking were going back to Dad's unit for processing.
Because everything was all kept secret, so one section would never know what the other section was doing.
Yeah.
For
Now,
protection.
he was a pilot of an aircraft, and a fighter aircraft. And when I talked to him, he was some kind of a real big shot up the ladder in the Air Force. Yeah. I don't know what you call the top man, but that's what he was.
That's pretty remarkable stuff.
Yeah.
When we were reviewing Dad's stories so that he could do his talk like a week ago or so, I was sitting at the computer and I was reading it to him to see if he wanted to add some things in or whatever. So he was talking about that V1. In fact, on that show, it said that it was the very first unmanned missile. What do they call those?
Rockets.
No.
It was the
There's a
first
word.
ever used anywhere
First ever,
in the
yeah,
world.
of
Yes.
where there's no man on it, and it was like a real
UAVs,
huge
isn't it?
rocket.
That's
Scud missile?
target.
Yeah, that type of thing. And so it showed one taking off, and it was the V1.
And showed the wings.
Yes.
Yes.
And it as you had described, it was, as what you said in your speech, it was a murmuring growl
Yeah.
that it made. And on the show, that's exactly what it was
They
a
said it
murmuring.
sounded like a motorcycle.
Yeah, but Dad had described it as a murmuring growl. And so as I was reading it through, I talked about the V1, and you could hear, when you heard the murmuring growl, and then you heard the silence. And then all of a sudden Dad went, there's the murmuring growl. We laughed for quite a while about that.
I'll never do that again. It was that bad.
Perfect timing.
Were those things, were they land launched?
Yeah.
Yes.
Off trailers.
So
Yeah.
they weren't off planes?
How many of them did they make?
No,
Okay.
yeah, from France.
How many did they make?
Yeah.
Oh.
Thousands.
Oh, and they would let off.
Did they make V2s too?
Yeah, the V2s
Yeah,
were right
they
near the
came
end of
up.
the war,
Yeah,
yeah.
there were a lot more.
We fired a few of those, but we finally managed to stop them before they got too many.
And apparently all the people that worked on the V2s were hired by NASA
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
at the end of the war.
but they said about the V1s that they had like 2,000
Yeah, there was a lot.
in like a day, or
Yeah.
it was something
Yeah, it was
incredible
They made
that,
2,000 a day?
No, 2,000 of them
that they
launched.
sent to England, to London, particularly.
cow.
Yeah, and I
What band
remember.
against London?
One of the stories that Mom had was that she was traveling on a bus to get to work, and that there was a bomb that actually hit the other end of the bus, the back of the bus, and she was on the front of the bus.
Wow.
Yeah,
Ooh.
yeah.
Was it a V1?
No, because I don't think there'd be much left of the bus. But I also like the story about when. Well, I mean, not like it, but. I like to hear the story about McAllister when you went to see him when he got blown up and he was all covered in bandages.
Chris. Well, that happened in England.
Yeah,
And
that's your buddy,
McAllister is,
who's 97 and he's still calling him now.
yeah.
Still bothering him.
He's what, about 7 feet tall?
He's
But
huge.
Mac and I,
6.5 feet at least.
yeah,
Yeah.
Mac married just before he left Canada. and he never saw his wife for 5 years. And he and I met him when I joined the unit, and he worked in one area and I worked in another, but we would get together and go on a day off together, and then when our leaves came, we'd take a leave together. So
And go climb a mountain in Scotland or
so
something
yeah,
like that?
so I say to Mac, well, okay, you want to go on a holiday? No drinking until the last day. Okay, and he agreed to it, and so we if we get a leave, we'd get maybe a week's leave, and they didn't come all that close together, but we would have a definite place that we would want to go, and so we would make arrangements then through the organizations in England who would place troops in different places. So we always had a decent home to go to spend 2 or 3 days or something, and that was really something.
Is that where you went to see Mr. McAllister?
Yeah, no, yeah.
Oh, that was a different one,
Yeah.
okay.
So anyway, one of these places that we went to, we were headed for Edinburgh, and we knew if we got into Edinburgh, we could go there and ask for a place that would give us a reference to a hotel in such and such a place, because there's going to be a group who's going to meet there. Now, Mac knew this because he had given some papers to a family in Edinburgh whose son, Mac didn't know it, but it turns out that his son was in the same kind of work in the Scottish outfit that he was with, as we're in. But that's a real coincidence. So Mac and I, we got to Edinburgh, and it took a whole day before we found a place that they could put us up with. But then we needed to find where in this town that we were going to go and climb this mountain is, and to find accommodation in there. So eventually we hitchhiked one way and another, and we ended up in this village. And it was a small town that there was a railway that passed through that town, and that was the only thing that there was in the town to call it a town was the railway station and a couple of pubs and 6 or 8 houses. And
Good house to pub ratio.
yeah.
Yes, for England.
They all worked in pubs and drank in pubs.
Now the place that we were to stay was at Bank House, which was the banker's home. And I remember by the time we got there, we were tired from walking the last mile or so, and we knocked on the door, and we had agreed that before we go any further, if we don't like what we get, our reception at that house, we will not stay there. We'll just make some excuse and go somewhere else. Well, when they opened the door, it was a nice greeting by a nice lady, and the man came up, and he was ever so friendly, and welcomed us in, and made us feel comfortable in their home by the fireside, and we had a nice meal, and we're all set to do something the next day. And so we told them what our plans were to go up this Ben Nevis, which is one of the highest that there is there. And that there is another person from another British outfit who is going to go there, because this is the guy back here that we took, and Mac took something to, and he said his son was in the survey, and that it'd be nice if we could meet him. Well, he is the one who we met in that group that we met, going to go up to this big mountain, yeah. And so he and Mac and I and 2 others, the next day, were all set to go up. We must have got 400 yards up the road leading from that, and it was a miserable day. It was raining, and somebody came out and hailed us and called us back and said, well, you better get something decent to wear. So it turns out that they had the mountain climbing organization of Scotland all meeting at that place where we were booked in. And we'd seen them when we went in that night. They were all sitting around the fireplace and books, and they were a bunch of old men to us. and we never thought anything of that they'd be the mountain climbers. But it turned out that's what the group was. So they loaned us their equipment. We had good climbing equipment, good ropes, good belts, whatever you needed to climb. And so we went further up that road, and I guess about a mile and a half, and this was the starting point to begin to climb Ben Nevis. And we set off to climb, and it seemed to me we were hours going up this piece that was fairly steep, but not all that steep. And then we came to a level place, and here was a huge boulder, big boulder. And the front face of that boulder had been cut off, and a big plaque had been put on it. And on that plaque was the list of the people who had gone up that mountain and never survived. Yeah. Anyway.
That's better than saying, do not climb.
Anyway, we set off up the mountain after we had something to eat at that point, and kept on, and it kept getting steeper and steeper, and more rivulets coming down, and more difficult to handle. And at one point we got up so high that we were in the clouds. Now we were missing the rain and the snow that we had just been going through for hours, and it got up just to the point we're above that. And there was part of it just seemed like a wall going up like this, but there was a narrow ledge that we had to navigate across. And we started across there, and I guess I slipped or something, but I thought I was going to go right down to the bottom of this thing. It must have been 500 feet below. And Mac reached out and he grabbed me and held me until I could get my feet back on. This is the kind of a guy he was.
We're glad you didn't fall. We're glad you didn't fall.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
None of us would be here today.
So we continued to do the climbing until we get up to the points where we could, the land began to slope towards a peak, and we never got to the peak when the British officer said that he said, this is far enough, we've done enough for one day, we should go back now, we'll never make it to the top tonight. And so we turned around and went back down. But somewhere I had shifted some rocks that had gone down. Past them, I'd got ahead of them. And then I didn't know it, but there was a second group behind us. And the second group had let up some yells on it.
The rocks coming down on them.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, we got back to the place, and the fellas were sitting around around the fireplace and smoking their cigars or whatever they do. And we went, we had a bath. And the bathtub was about 7 feet long and about this wide, and you could get about that much water.
Enough for all three of you.
Yeah, that's right. But I remember seeing Mac sitting in there with just his head above the edge of the bath. And someone knocked at the door and then opened the door and came in. And here it was another one of the climbers who had been down the stairs, and he had a tray with drinks on and napkins for each of us, and so we all had a drink or two, spin a few yarns, put our clothes on. I had a bath too. Mac had one after me. But
in that order, had a few drinks, so the stories then got dressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I vaguely
It's
remember
good
a
to be
story you
first and
told
the
about
best.
when you were walking through the field somewhere in over in Europe, and you knew the Germans were watching you.
Yeah, what,
You were what?
And you came across a German a soldier that was dead, a German soldier.
It was a grave.
A grave.
oh, yeah, yeah. Well,
That was Mac.
no, it wasn't. That was a case of where we were, what the heck were we doing? But you never knew where the Germans were going to be. Now, it might only be 4 or 5 Germans who have got separated or who cowed down when it got heavy fighting for them or something. And you never knew where you would come across this. But this time,
Were you guys given guns? just in case?
we had come to a grave, and it was a German grave, but what we did was we went and we stood in front of that grave, to attention, hats off, and all this sort of stuff, and as if we were saying a prayer for that dead German, because we could hear this little group of Germans coming along, and if they were going to shoot, 10 to 1 they won't shoot if they see that we're honoring a German grave. So when they passed, maybe 50 feet away, and Mac and I went to get back on the motorbike that I had been driving, and to take off. So that was a interesting experience, and you don't want to go through too many of them.
Adam was asking if you carried a gun.
I had a rifle until we started getting ready to go overseas, and about 2 months before that, they like to start going over the channel to the battles. They started to issue us with Sten guns, which are a rapid fire type of thing, and the reason for that was that it was likely that we were going to be lodged from time to time where there's dwellings that are in German hands, and if we have a weapon of that type, we have a much better chance of defending ourselves than we have with just a single rifle.
So
But-
like a machine gun instead of a single shot.
Yeah,
What was it called?
a Sten gun, yeah, and it's had a barrel about that long, and a chamber for you to shove it. The bullets would be in a container like a pencil holder,
Yeah, magazine.
and the magazine would come up under here, and as you fired it once, the shell would come out and a new shell would come in. So you could, and it had a shoulder. It was a thing like this.
Had a metal stock. It's hollow.
Now, I last year I went to downtown to a special program that was on where we had lunch and dinner and so on, and there was a guard standing out in front of the museum, not the museum, the armories down right downtown in Ottawa here, and he was standing with his stun gun at ease with it like this. And I went up and I spoke to him and I said, we used to use one of these quite a bit. And he looked at it. He didn't seem like he knew too much about it, because I think I asked him about some parts of it, and he certainly had never.
Probably a little embarrassed by that.
Well, whether he had ever had ammunition for it,
Right.
I doubt. Yeah.
When what led up to Mac McAllister being in hospital all wrapped in bandages?
Oh yeah. Okay. Mac had got a call from another unit. Our commanding officer wanted another sergeant to go somewhere else.
Oh, wrong.
And so he wanted Mac to go. And so Mac was changed to go with this British outfit. And it was some time when we had moved along quite a bit that I heard that Mac was in the hospital back 20 miles. And had been seriously wounded. How he was wounded, I have no idea. But I thought, no, if I take a break, you know, take a period when my time's up, I can go down and visit Mac. And all I've got to do is find a guy with a motorcycle to get me that 20 miles. So there was a fellow delivering messages who just came along at the right time, and I told him what I wanted to do and what I wanted to see, and he said, I got to go by there. He said, hop on. So I rode on the back of his motorbike, and we got down to this, I saw this old church which had been taken over as an emergency hospital, so I went through that big door of that church, and I cut into sort of another part, and there was another door there. And just as I opened the second door, I saw a nurse coming down this aisle. And there were beds on both sides of that aisle that she was coming down that were quite makeshift beds. They weren't proper beds. And I started to walk down towards her, and she stopped me and asked me what I wanted. And I said, I want to see Sergeant McAllister. He's here. He's one of your patients. And I had no idea what condition he was in. So she walked down, and I walked behind her, and then she stopped and she pointed to the bed. Now Mac was right on the corner of this. This is where Mac was. And I took a second look. It can't be Mac. And he was covered right from head to foot with bandages, except the whole hair. That's all. Went right on, his arms, his legs, and everything laying out there, just like that. And I went over and stood beside him for a minute, and I could see he was breathing, but there wasn't any sound at all. So as I walked back toward the foot of where he was, I said to the nurse, what do you think his chances are? She didn't say anything to me, she just kind of shook her head. And she was the head nurse. So I figured he must be in pretty bad shape. So I went out to the front door, and in that section I said it was sort of between doors. And I said a good prayer for Mac. And sometime later I found out that he'd been sent back to England, had treatment, and that he was then being sent around to the places that he and I went on our holidays, so that it would bring back his memory, and he would have fluent speech again. Well, Mac went through that. He got back in the army uniform, back in France, but he was on further this time. He was on in the boundaries of Germany, where all the military materials were being stored, and he was one of those in charge of the guard for that storage. Now, next time I saw him, I guess it was one day in Canada. So there was something, I heard that he was in Ottawa, and that he was visiting with somebody that he knew within about 4 blocks of where I live. So I went and knocked on the door and met the person who he's there staying with, and then met Mac again. And since then we've been back and forth in terms of telephone calls. I had a call from him just a week ago. Now he's, I'm not sure whether he's 99 or 98, one or the other. But he's
Still pretty good.
he's going on for 100.
39. That's basically.
So you wouldn't think his experiences did any harm. Yeah.
Do you know what happened to him? Do you know what happened to him to put him in the hospital?
No, he doesn't know.
No, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody else knows.
Yeah.
You never know.
Would
You
you
know,
think
if he got beat that much.
Do you think he would know if you asked him?
Pardon?
Have you asked Max?
No, he didn't.
Like, do you think he would know what happened?
Oh, I really don't know. I never asked him.
I
I
guess
never
there's
did
some
ask.
things you don't ask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we got a
Well,
drive ahead of us, we gotta
yeah.
get the boys home for bed, so.
If he's knocked out that much, I doubt if he'd know what happened.
Yeah, you'd remember everything.
You have to read what I wrote. I didn't know you liked raisins.
Well, that was a nice storytelling
Awesome.
time, Dad.
Yeah, that was
Thanks
great.
for that. Do you know what Kimmy recorded the whole thing on that?